After years of supporting my daughter emotionally and financially, she looked me in the eye and said that I was just another mouth to feed. I'm not sure what hurt more. The moment she ordered me out of her house, like someone sweeping up a crumb, or the way she finally referred to me, extra mouth, as if that's all I am now, an expense that breathes. My name is Ronald. I'm 58 years old, and this story begins long before the day I was kicked out of my daughter's house. It begins, perhaps, on the first day I kept quiet to avoid conflict, or the first Christmas when I realized that my present came with guilt. Or perhaps it began on the day I buried my wife and, along with her, the part of my daughter that still sweetly called me Dad. Since then, I've become invisible. Not all at once, not in a clear way. I disappeared into the weariness of others. After Cindy died, my wife, my anchor, I thought that taking care of Hannah was a purpose. She was 16 at the time. She was rebellious, sharp with her words and with that adolescent way of believing that the world owed her explanations. And I understood. I understood why she had lost her mother. Because I had too. But unlike her, I wasn't allowed to break it. Someone had to look after the house, pay the bills, do the shopping, understand the bills, know about pads, clothes, school timetables, and nighttime panic attacks. Someone had to take care of everything. And that someone was me. For years, Hannah was the reason I didn't jump off the cliff of depression. She was also the reason I took medication in hiding, cried in the bathroom, and pretended everything was fine, even when I didn't even know what fine was. I worked as a delivery boy, then in the stockroom of a supermarket, and, when I was made redundant, I took any job I could to make ends meet. I sold used tools at the market, cleaned yards, repaired what I knew, and what I didn't know, I learned on YouTube. When she went to college, I thought, it'll work out. I've done my bit. But it didn't work out like that. Hannah never went home after that. She stayed on campus, slept in hostels, said she was too busy. And I understood. Again, I told myself that it was life taking its course, that it was normal for children to move away. But inside me, something was already cracking. When she graduated, she didn't invite me to the ceremony. She said it was a small thing, that it would just be her and her friends. I lied to my colleagues at the fair, saying that I went, that I got emotional, that I cried with pride. The truth is that I did cry, but at home, alone, looking at a photo of her when she was 8 years old, and still calling me my superhero. After she got a job in a digital marketing company, Hannah moved into a rented house with her boyfriend. I went to visit her about 3 times, always with packed lunches that I made sure to take with me. I never ate with them. She said they were tired, that they were going out. So I'd leave the food in the fridge, catch the bus back, and tell myself that it was too much to have seen her face. It was on one of these visits that she said, the words, Dad. We can't do it anymore. We need space. The house is cramped and, well, you know, you don't work anymore. You don't help with the bills and, I'm sorry, but we can't afford an extra mouth. I swear I didn't understand what she meant for a good 10 seconds. Extra mouth. It wasn't just any expression. It was the complete reduction of a father who once washed her hair with baby shampoo because she was screaming with a burning eye. It was the erasure of a man who sold his wedding ring to pay for a university course. It was the summary of who I was now, a cost. I left with the dignity of someone who wants to believe that he is still loved. I pretended not to care. I smiled, said I understood, that it was fine, that I was grateful for the months they had taken me in. I offered to go out that same night, slept at the bus station, and told myself that this was just a phase. But it wasn't. It was the beginning of the end. Or maybe just the end. I went back to living in a rented room above a garage, where the smell of burning oil sickened me, and the mattress sank in. I spent the next few days trying to understand where exactly I was no longer needed. I went over every memory, like someone trying to find a crack in the walls of the past. But it wasn't just one crack. It was an entire system collapsing. I was swallowed up by it. The following Sunday, she called. I picked up thinking I'd changed my mind, but on the other end of the line, her voice was shaking. She told me she was in hospital. She spoke of kidney failure. She said she needed a donor urgently. She said my name as if to say, salvation. I took a deep breath. I felt everything in me tremble. My chest burned. My throat closed. I still said yes. I thought that when the time came to prove that I was still a father, that I still mattered, I would hesitate. I thought that perhaps the pain of rejection would be greater than instinct, but it wasn't. When I heard her voice shaking on the other end of the line, when I realized that it was my name that the doctors had suggested as a possible donor, something inside me silenced everything I felt. Pride was silenced. The hurt was silenced. The resentment I'd hardly known I'd been carrying for years turned to silence. And in place of all that, only one thing remained: urgency. The hospital was a modern building, with tinted glass windows and a constant smell of disinfectant. It wasn't the first time I'd entered an emergency room, but it was the first time I'd entered as part of the body that could save another. I never imagined that my tired, aging kidneys, rejected by basic health plans, would one day be the difference between living and dying for someone, and much less that that someone would be the very person who discarded me. The first time I saw her in hospital, she looked small, much smaller than I remembered. She was pale, with deep-set eyes and that haggard look that turns any young person into someone with decades of weight on their back. She didn't see me. I stood outside the glass door, watching. Hannah was asleep, and for a moment, I saw the little girl who once cried in the middle of the night because she dreamt she was alone in the world. And now, in a way, she was, alone with her own decisions. I did the tests, all of them. I had my arm pierced so many times that I don't even know which vein they put the needle in anymore. I passed through rooms where they asked if I was aware of the risks, if I was sure, if I really wanted to donate an organ. Each time my answer was the same: I want to. No beating around the bush, no sob story, just that. I want it. Nobody understood. Not the doctors, not the social workers, least of all the other patients in the waiting ward who looked at me as if I were a martyr or a fool. But the truth is that when you spend too much time being ignored, rejected, treated as a spare part, the act of donating a piece of yourself seems poetic. As if it were the last thing you had to offer. As if, even if no one sees you as a father anymore, you could still be useful, if only for the last time. She thanked me on the third day, in a low voice, without looking at me. She said, "Thank you, Dad," like someone says, "Good morning," to a doorman. But I didn't expect more than that. The truth was that after so long being reminded only when something was missing, I had already accepted that perhaps her gratitude would never be greater than the discomfort of having me around. I stayed in a hostel 2 blocks from the hospital, with a musty smell and a wall stained with infiltration. The sheets were thin, and the shower water took forever to heat up, but at least I could lie down and not hear anyone call me heavy. There was a 70-year-old man on the top bunk who snored like a tractor, and we shared packets of cookies at night. He didn't ask me anything, and I didn't say anything. It was a silent agreement between 2 strangers broken by life. The week before the surgery, I was called to a meeting with the medical team. They explained everything again, that the procedure was risky for someone my age, that recovery would be slow, that the post-operative period could affect my quality of life. And, as always, they asked if I was sure. I signed the papers with a trembling pen, not out of fear, but because there, in that simple act of signing, I realized how little of me still existed outside of Hannah, as if my life only made sense when it revolved around her, even if she didn't want to revolve around it. The day before the operation, I went to the hospital chapel. I'm not religious. I never have been. But I sat on the wooden bench and stood there, staring at the empty altar, smelling the old candles. I stayed silent, trying to talk to Cindy, even though I knew she might not hear me. I asked her if I was doing the right thing, if she would be proud, if Hannah, somewhere inside her, was still capable of love. I received no answer, just the distant sound of the air conditioning blowing against the curtains, but I left feeling lighter. Not because I'd been heard, but because I'd finally said what I'd been trapped in. On the morning of the surgery, I put on that light blue apron with the smell of plastic and walked through the cold corridors with slow steps. No one from her family was there. Not her boyfriend, no friends, just me, the man who had once been called a hero, but was now just a useful body, lying on a stretcher. The nurse shook my hand before entering the operating room. She said she admired my courage. I smiled with moist eyes, not because of my courage, but because suddenly someone looked at me as a human again. When the anesthetic began to take effect, my last memory was of the white ceiling spinning and the muffled sound of hurried footsteps. Then, everything went dark. I woke up with a heavy body and a silence that seemed to expand from the inside out. It was as if my bones were drenched in anesthesia, and my chest was carrying something that still had no name. It took me a few seconds to remember where I was, why I was there, and what I had lost. Because donating an organ is exactly that, a loss, however noble, however necessary. When I realized that my body was half gone, that there was something less inside me, I didn't cry. Not because of pain, but because I had survived. Because up until that moment, a part of me believed that perhaps it would be better if I never woke up again. The first voice I heard was that of a young nurse, with tired eyes and a protocol smile. She called me Mr. Ronald and said that the procedure had been a success, that my daughter was fine, that her kidneys had responded, that I should rest. And then she left, like all people who always leave after fulfilling their role. I spent the next 2 days in that white bed, surrounded by opaque curtains and the intermittent beeps of heart monitors. I received no visitors. I received no flowers. I received no messages. I only received medication in my vein and brief glances from hurried professionals. Inside, I felt a strange mixture of relief and emptiness. I had done what needed to be done. I had saved my daughter, but nobody seemed to remember that. It was as if it had all been my duty, as if the act of donating a kidney was just the natural continuation of years of being useful. On the third day, a social worker visited me. She said she wanted to talk to me, to understand how I was feeling. I think it was the first time anyone had really asked me that in a long time. "How are you feeling, Mr. Ronald?" And I almost laughed, because how does someone answer that after being kicked out of their own daughter's house, and days later, being cut open on an operating table so that that same daughter stays alive? I told her I was fine, that I was tired, but calm. She wrote something down on a clipboard and left in the same hurry as she came in, and I stayed there, with the metallic taste in my mouth, my body stitched up, the silence screaming. I was discharged at the end of the week. They handed me the papers with the instructions, the medicines, the return times. There was no one to pick me up. I took a cab with the money left over from my disability pension. I went back to the musty room at the boarding house with my hands shaking, my stomach throbbing, and a plastic pharmacy bag banging against my knee at every turn. The driver tried to make conversation. He asked if it was a simple surgery or something serious. I replied that I'd had a piece of myself removed. He laughed, thinking it was a metaphor, and I didn't have the heart to explain that it wasn't. That night, I lay on the sunken mattress and felt the wound pull. I couldn't turn on my side. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't find a position. I spent hours staring at the stained ceiling, listening to the footsteps of the old man on the top bunk and the sound of a television leaking from a nearby room. At some point in the early hours of the morning, I realized that it wasn't the physical pain that was keeping me awake. It was the emptiness, the realization that I had given everything, and it was still too little. I was still expendable. Over the next few days, I tried to occupy myself. I organized my medication, wrote down timetables, and went for short walks. The doctor had been clear: slow recovery. Watch out for signs of infection. No physical exertion. I followed everything to the letter. Not for me, but because if anything went wrong, they could use that as an excuse to say I was irresponsible. Even after everything, I was still afraid of being seen as a problem. It's hard to explain, but when you spend a lot of time being the problem solver, you start to feel like you're not allowed to fail, not even when you're falling apart, inside. I haven't spoken to Hannah, nor did she speak to me. I learned that she was recovering well from a nurse I met in the corridor of the clinic during one of her returns. She said that the young girl who received the kidney was already walking, eating well, full of plans. And then she asked me, like someone looking for a nice story, she must be very grateful, right? And I just smiled, because I couldn't explain that it wasn't about gratitude. It wasn't about giving something back. It was about absence, about the hole she'd dug between the two of us, and that even after all this, that hole was still there, maybe even bigger. On the 20th day after the surgery, I received a call from her, the first since my hospitalization. I answered with a low voice, almost insecure, and on the other end came a cold, practical hello. She wanted to know if I'd received the test receipts yet, because her plan needed to archive everything. She asked how I was, but didn't wait for an answer. She said she was moving to another state with her boyfriend, that she'd got a new job, that she was starting from scratch. I wished her luck. She thanked me and hung up. I stared at the phone for a good few minutes. That black screen looked like a mirror of everything that remained of us. A disconnected line, an interrupted conversation, a broken bond. And at that moment, I understood something that might have hurt less if I had realized it before the surgery. I was never saved by her, but I saved her nonetheless. Time has a cruel way of passing when you don't expect anything from it. The days following the surgery began to drain away from me like warm water from a poorly closed tap, neither fast enough to distract nor slow enough to give me time to process. They simply came and went, dragging with them what little routine I had left. I took my medication on time, followed the doctor's instructions, walked slowly along the neighborhood's cracked sidewalks. Sometimes I sat on the bench in front of the garage and watched the cars come and go, as if there were whole lives inside them that hadn't stopped to wonder if someone next door had given up a piece of themselves in the hope of being seen. No one in the hostel knew about the surgery. The old man on the top bunk thought I'd had a hernia operation. The girl in the next room offered me soup on a rainy day, saying that my face was looking a bit haggard. I thanked her with a smile, even though I knew she had no idea what I had lost. Because that's what happens when you spend your life being useful. The pain becomes silence, and the silence becomes part of the furniture. Nobody notices. I received a deposit of $200 from Hannah. No message, no explanation, just the amount in the account and her name on the receipt. I stared at it like someone who finds a torn photo of someone who has already died. That wasn't help. It was a transfer of consciousness, as if she was trying to turn into numbers what she'd never had the courage to say with her mouth. I saved the money. I used some of it to buy better antibiotics and some to pay the rent on the boarding house. And the rest just sat there, as a reminder that sometimes even relief comes contaminated. Her life went on. I heard about it from others. A friend at the hospital said that the transplant girl had left town. She was fine, healthy, employed. A nurse said she had seen photos of her on social media, smiling next to her boyfriend on the balcony of a new apartment. I didn't see the photos. I didn't look for them, but they always arrived by some crooked route, as if the world insisted on rubbing irony in my face. My daughter was alive, starting a new life, and I was here, older, weaker, lonelier than ever. I began to wonder if she would have done the same for me, if the roles had been reversed, if I had been the patient on the stretcher, if she would have been able to give up a piece of her body, her routine, her life, to keep me here. And no matter how hard I tried to imagine another answer, all that came was silence. A silence that wasn't just about her. It was about time, the accumulated abandonment, the way I was pushed to the edge of the story until there were no subtitles left. I began to have trouble sleeping. The physical pain had subsided, but there was a kind of tiredness that accompanied me everywhere, a tiredness of existing. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, with my mouth dry and my heart racing, as if my body was still waiting for an answer that wasn't coming. I'd go into the kitchen of the boarding house, drink warm water from the plastic bottle, and look out of the window at nothing. And every time, the same thought came back. I shouldn't have done that. Not because I regret saving her life, but because I saved someone who doesn't care. It's hard to admit that. For a father, it's almost blasphemy. But the truth is that there is no manual for dealing with forgetfulness. Nobody prepares you for being ignored after an act as intimate as donating an organ. No one teaches you how to react when you realize that the blood bond is more fragile than the ego of the person you created. She never sent me a letter. She never called me to find out how my recovery was going. She never asked if I needed any help with medication, bandages, or anything else. And if she did that mentally, she never got through to me. One day, I went to the hospital for a routine checkup. The doctor asked if my daughter was following the tests, if she had shown any concern for my health. I shook my head and looked away. He didn't say anything. He just sighed. And in that sigh, I heard what he didn't have the courage to say. I knew, and he knew it too, that there are people who only know how to ask, that there are people who only show up when they need to, that there are bonds that die even when their bodies are still alive. On the way home, I stopped at the same bench where I used to sit before the surgery. I sat down slowly, feeling the left side of my stomach tighten. The sky was overcast, and the smell of gasoline from the garage permeated the air. I sat there for hours, not touching anything, not talking to anyone, just watching people go by, carrying bags, in a hurry, cell phones stuck to their faces, and I wondered how many of them knew what it was like to be remembered only when they needed to be. How many had become extra mouths after a lifetime of giving their all. That afternoon, I decided that I wouldn't call Hannah anymore. I wouldn't text her. I wouldn't ask her how her new job was going, or her new apartment, or her new life. I had to stop hurting myself where there was no more room for me. I had to learn, even with my soul in tatters, that sometimes the greatest act of love isn't to insist, it's to stop from trying, from insisting, from serving. Because I had already given away a piece of my body, and there was nothing left of me that she wanted. Over time, I learned to stop waiting. It wasn't a pretty learning curve, nor was it quick. It's like relearning to walk after losing a limb. You know you're missing something, but you have to keep going anyway. And if you stumble, there's no one to hold your hand. You go it alone, because you were left alone. I stopped looking at my cell phone, waiting for her notifications. I stopped rehearsing birthday messages, asking how things were going, justifying my existence with attempts to get closer. I even stopped remembering the date of the surgery, because it became just another number on a dusty calendar. Hannah never came to me again. Not out of concern, not out of affection, not out of any kind of longing that, time and again, escapes even the ungrateful. It was as if the organ I had taken from her no longer connected her to anything, or to me. What should have been a rebirth of us became a definitive cut, an absence transplant. She was given a new lease of life, and I was given the brutal realization that I wasn't part of her. I went back to work as best I could. I started repairing old radios, selling parts at the market at weekends. Some of my colleagues were sympathetic when they saw my sluggish manner, but they didn't ask too many questions. And I liked it that way, because telling the truth is even more painful than living it, as if verbalizing everything would confirm the abandonment, engraving it in relief on my forehead. And I already had too many scars on my body to carry them on the skin of my soul. One day, I ran into an acquaintance of Cindy's in the queue at the pharmacy, one of those women who hugs tightly and speaks too loudly to hide her embarrassment. She recognized me, smiled, and said that she had seen Hannah on the internet. She was beautiful, healthy, had bought a car, and was traveling with her boyfriend. She said all this as if she expected me to be proud, but I just nodded, thanked her for the update, paid for my medication with the last money in my pocket, and left before she asked anything personal, because not everyone understands that pride can't survive where there has only been contempt. Later that week, I received a letter. It was simple, with a white envelope and familiar handwriting. I thought it was an advertisement or a bill, but when I opened it, I found a sheet of paper written in blue ink. It was from her, the first and only time in months. I read it carefully, line by line. It was a cold, objective letter, full of lines that seemed to avoid rather than approach. She said she was grateful, that the procedure had changed her life, that she now saw things more clearly. But at no point did she say she missed me. At no point did she call me father with the warmth she once used. And in the end, she made it clear that she was starting again from scratch, that he didn't want to relive old dynamics, that he hoped I would understand. Understand. That was the word that hurt the most, because that's all she ever expected of me, that I would understand when she didn't call me, that I would understand when she kicked me out of the house, that I understood when she disappeared, when she lied, when she walked away. May I understand as if a father's love were eternal, but one-sided, as if the act of giving was my destiny, and hers was just to receive and follow. I tucked the folded letter into an old book, between pages that were already crumbling like me. I didn't reply, not because I didn't have anything to say, but because I finally realized that my words were never heard. They were noise, and there's nothing more humiliating than pouring yourself out in the form of affection and being treated like interference. The following spring, I received a call from the hospital. It wasn't about Hannah, it was about me. Routine scans showed that the only remaining kidney wasn't working as it should. They said it might be time to think about a transplant queue. I laughed, a short, dry, almost cynical laugh, because now I was the one who needed it. Now I was the one who would be the weight. And there was no one in my emergency file. No next of kin, no contact number, no one. The assistant hesitated on the other end of the line and asked if there were any relatives. I said no, and for once, it wasn't an exaggeration. The irony of it all didn't escape me. I had saved someone who had forgotten me, and now, sick, I didn't even have a name to put down as a companion. It was the poetic end that my life called for, an ending without an audience, a silent epilogue. I started going to appointments on my own, taking tests in the same old lab coat, listening to doctors talking about possible complications with the same tone as someone reading a bill of exchange. I wasn't afraid. I had a kind of resignation, like someone who accepts that they won't be remembered, but has still left something important behind. On one of those trips to the hospital, I sat on a bench and watched a father pushing his daughter in a wheelchair. She was laughing at something he was saying, and he smiled with his eyes full. And I felt envious, not of their health, but of their existence, of the connection, the reciprocity, something I never had, not with Hannah. With her, it was always a one-way street. Me going, her turning the corner. I never saw her again, not even in a photo, not in a dream, not in the news. In any case, my daughter survived, but not me. The man who donated the kidney is still breathing, yes, but the one who believed in the bond, in blood love, in gratitude between parents and children. He stayed on the operating table, and he didn't wake up with me. Today, I'm just an old man with a void in my body and another in my history. And if there's one thing I've learned at the end of all this, it's that not every sacrifice becomes a bridge. Sometimes it becomes an abyss. And I was the fool who walked to the middle thinking that I would be reached. I was just an extra mouthful. But even so, I gave my last piece. And no one came back to feed me, not even with a memory. If you had to choose between being remembered with contempt or forgotten with indifference, which of the two would hurt less?